Good morning. I'm Kelsey Gordon, an Operations Program Manager at Microsoft here in Fargo. Thank you for joining us for our fourth session in a six-part Building Inclusive and Equitable Workplace training series. I want to thank you all for your patience and understanding 2 weeks ago at our most recent recording as we experienced unexpected and sudden technical difficulties, which prevented us from streaming the session live. If you are unable to join us last Tuesday for the live stream, the recording has been posted and you can find it at the bottom of the same page you are viewing this live stream at. Again, thank you for joining us for the fourth training, Culture Competencies. What are they and why are they important? If you missed any of our previous 3 sessions, the business case, why a diverse, equitable, and inclusion strategy is important for business success, inclusive leadership, beyond leadership buy-in to leadership in action, or unconscious bias, self-awareness leads to organizational awareness. Please feel free to get caught up after today's session by viewing the recording posted below. Before I turn it over to Kiera today, just a couple notes. 1, as you're listening along, please feel free to utilize the question and answer tab or discussion feature on the right side of the live stream. If you would like to ask your question anonymously, please feel free to enter anonymous into the required name box. 2, tomorrow afternoon, the Chamber will distribute a post-event survey as well as the SHRM and HRCI codes for those of you seeking continuing education credits. Additionally, this session recording will be available for you to rewatch if you wish or share with colleagues sometime next week. 3, finally, as a reminder, the link you received for today's webinar will be the same link utilized for the final 2 sessions. Now help me welcome our presenter, Kiera Kimball. I look forward to seeing you all again on Thursday, November 5th for Enhancing Your Employer Brand, Recruitment, Retention, and Engagement Strategies through a diverse, equitable, and inclusion lens. Kiera, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It is so great to be with you here today on our 4th installment. I'll be talking about cultural competencies today, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you best practices and also doing some teaching around what cultural competencies really are. Can you believe we're already in our 4th session? The fall is going so quickly, and today's session is going to empower you, and it's going to continue on the journey and building blocks that we've set forth from our first session. And as Kelsey said, if you hadn't had an opportunity yet to check out the unconscious bias recording, I really encourage you to do so because it is a foundational piece about building a DE&I strategy. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the learning outcomes I hope to accomplish today. Why it is important to implement a cultural competency strategy. What happens when an organization does not value cultural competency, and how does this play out? How an organization can create learning and development for your team around cultural competency. And then finally, what are the insights into the skill set, the competencies we need, and the mindset that will help embolden and foster cultural competency within our organizations? So this is a slide you've all seen. I know I am relentless about sharing it. It's just critically important for us to understand the big picture of diversity and how it shows up in our workplaces and in our communities. But today's focus will be a little bit different when we're thinking about cultural competency. You'll probably land more in learning about ethnicity, country of origin. We'll look at the impact of different religions and spiritual beliefs. We'll talk a little bit about geography, and certainly we'll look into values and beliefs of individuals. So first off, let's set the groundwork and really define what is culture. And I'm not talking about organizational culture today, although that's critically important, and we'll talk a lot about that next time. What I'm talking about is the big C in terms of culture. Customs and traditions. How do we celebrate together? What do our holidays look like? How about coming of age? Not every culture has a sweet 16. There are different ways that we look at coming of age. In the Jewish culture, it might be a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah as examples. What do our weddings look like? Our customs for death as an example. What do our food or how we dress represent our culture? In terms of beliefs and values, different cultures define honor, mercy, or compassion. Justice is looked at differently. How about morality and ethics? How do we make decisions about what success looks like? Truth. So big question types of, big answer types of questions, if you will. How about social norms? How do we define family? What does parenting or caregiving look like? We talked about gender roles in last time's session, and different cultures look at gender differently. So having an idea about these social norms that we practice or with colleagues that we engage with across the plant floor, the cubicle, the office as examples. When we look at language, some cultures speak quickly and have a fast cadence. Others have a slower cadence. How about our nonverbals? The okay sign means very different things in different cultures. And we want to make sure that we know this when we're representing that nonverbal. Another example might be pursing the lips to use as a directional, as an example. So that might seem odd if I look through my worldview, because that is not something that I do. But when I'm working with an individual, it's important to have an awareness about these language or nonverbals, if you will. So all of these things are really comprising what culture is. And this is the awareness that we can bring in our workplaces. Now, do we have to know every single detail about colleagues, coworkers, customers, cultures? No, we don't. The good news is the practices and the behaviors that we do are going to help tee us up to be successful in these relationships. So let's look at the next slide and talk about culture through a worldview. And typical fashion, I really like to give examples based on my lived experience, because that's what I know best and what I can share for you. So our culture, our individual culture, provides the lens through which we define our world, how we see the world, how we value the world. And that worldview is really coupled with our intersections of diversity, going back to that honeycomb chart, that we all show up, no matter who we are, with some intersections of diversity. So when I think about my own story as an individual, I am an American. That is my country of origin. I am a rural American, and that's an important distinguishment in terms of differences that we might see in more urban situations. I celebrate the Christian faith. So when we think about different religions or spiritual beliefs, I am seeing the world through those lenses. I'm also a Gen Xer, being 50 years old. I have the social, political, historical context, if you will, of growing up during that time period. And that was the Cold War, the Berlin Wall coming down, latchkey kids. And that has a lot to do with my development as an individual. Iran-Contra, the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. Those are some things of my youth and growing up. So our social, political, and historical context really informs our worldview, whether it's where we're growing up at, when we grew up, who we grew up with, or where we are today. So when I think about customs for me and traditions, and we think about this time of year, because there is a lot that goes on in American society around the fourth quarter, if you will, with different holidays. I loved Thanksgiving, one of my favorite holidays growing up, getting together at my great-grandmother Ethel's, eating throughout the day, playing with my cousins. It was a fabulous holiday that I looked forward to celebrating every year. But not all of our neighbors or coworkers might look towards Thanksgiving with great delight. And in fact, when we think about our Native or Indigenous neighbors and community members, this is a holiday that they may look at with great disdain. And they may think of genocide. They may think of colonization as examples. So even though in my worldview, in my history, in my traditions, cultures, beliefs, celebrate with great energy, not everyone is going to bring that. So having that awareness in our workplaces is critically important. I also love the 4th of July. I got a lot of sunburns out on that lake outside of here in South Dakota, again, with my many cousins enjoying. And when I think of 4th of July, that's Independence Day in our history. But for some communities, it shows up differently. We've talked about Juneteenth as an example, where the Black community really looks at Juneteenth as their emancipation and their freedom, different from the 4th of July. So having that awareness again in our workplaces that not everyone may show up with excitement about something that you're celebrating is a critical cultural competency. When we think about holding hands as an example, often that indicates some form of intimacy. It might be with one's partner, it could be with parents, it could be with children as an example. But when we think about different cultures, in fact, in the African culture or the Middle Eastern culture, it is common for men who are having a day-to-day conversation with one another to hold one another's hands. And I had an amazing experience in graduate school when I was walking down the Purdue Mall, a big grassy area, with one of my friends, one of my classmates, and she was from Singapore. We were friends and we were headed to have lunch together. And while we were walking across the mall, the grassy area, she grabbed my hand and we held each other's hands as we were walking to lunch together. And in her culture, that's a sign of friendship and intimacy from a friendship level. So again, these were new experiences for me. And when I went to Bolivia and spent time there, recognizing through trying to look at the world through their lens, taking off my glasses, my worldview, I learned a lot about what family looks like in Bolivia in terms of very extended and taking care of not only children, but the elderly. I learned new different definitions of wealth from my living perspective and my worldview. I really saw wealth as financial success, where in Bolivia, a lot of individuals define it as joy. So having these insights, this is really about developing that cultural competency. I wanted to do some polling, but I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm just going to kind of call these out because we lost some minutes. And what I'd like to do on these next slides is really have you be present. And I want you to be aware of what's bubbling up for you in terms of maybe some evaluations or judgments that you might have coming to the surface about language or words. And I want you to be aware about your perceptions, and maybe you'll even feel some biases jump up. Maybe they're unconscious and you're having some awareness about them. So I'm going to do this exercise again, not an official poll, but just in your heads, if you will. And this is a way really for us to facilitate thinking about what we might know, what our cultural competency might be, and perhaps where there might be some opportunities. So let's look at these slides. So I want you to think about, is the winter solstice a religious holiday? And when I think of my worldview, again, I identify as a Christian, a religious holiday for me, it would be Christmas around this time of year and not the winter solstice. But there are other spiritual or religious beliefs, and the winter solstice by the Wiccan or pagans would celebrate this as a religious or spiritual holiday. And you see some symbols before. Symbolism is also part of culture. We see the green man, which is a symbol for the Wiccan faith, spirituality, and that's about nature. We see a pentagram or a pendant, and oftentimes then would be curious, when you saw that, if maybe you went to darker ways of thinking, as opposed to being a symbol for a Wiccan religion and celebration. So again, coming through our lens, we may not have insight to this. And lots of us right now are probably planning holiday parties, and we might be doing it differently this year in terms of a virtual experience. Some of us might call it Christmas. And because that is centering on the majority, more than likely, population in our workplaces or in our communities. And that comes from our worldview. Some of us in our organizations are trying to broaden and be more inclusive. Maybe we're looking at holiday. So someone who is a Wiccan celebrating that in your organization could feel included. Others of us are leaving out holiday and calling it the end of the year celebration. So how can the language that we use, how when we come together as an organization, can we make sure that we're lifting up others in our workplace? This question, which is not a Jewish symbol above of those four, and the headpiece that individual is wearing is called a kippah. So a Jewish symbol, dreidel, Star of David, and menorah. The lotus flower is not a Jewish symbol. That happens to be a strong symbol of the Buddhist faith. So having these insights, and again, what do our fourth quarter celebrations look like? And are we creating space? Are we seeing some of our colleagues who might celebrate a different faith than we do? Other cultural competencies, we talked about part of culture is having insight into nonverbals. Limited eye contact is a sign of respect in which culture? Limited eye contact. Out of those four, the Asian culture lifts that behavior up as a sign of respect or deference to an individual. So let's talk about how this could play out in the workplace. If you are part of a search committee and are recruiting a candidate, perhaps for a teaching position or an analyst position or a medical provider position or a manufacturing position, you have an individual come in who celebrates this culture, whether it's Asian American, and they bring that from their country of origin, or their family who may have been a generation that lived in an Asian country. They bring this behavior, and if we don't have insight into that, we might see their lack of eye contact as a sign of not being engaged, of not respecting us. And we might miss a really great opportunity to bring a star team member to our organization. Or how about when you're doing performance reviews and you have an individual, and this could also be a member of the native population as an example. Oftentimes limited eye contact is part of their practice. And again, I'm not talking about 100%, but it is represented. So if you're giving a performance review and this person isn't looking at you, or you're considering them for a promotion, the biggest client, the biggest customer, the biggest opportunity, and you say, this person is not engaged, they're not bringing energy to it, I'm going to pick this person who has clear eye contact. Again, we're missing an opportunity and a nuance. So having insight that there are different ways of communicating, styles of leading is critical. Practicing Muslims must fast during Ramadan. So typically when we think about Ramadan, we think about yes or no, black or white, that yes, people who practice as a Muslim, the Islam faith, are fasting during Ramadan. And the reality is there are individuals who maybe are elderly, are breastfeeding, have diabetes or another sickness, and that is not a requirement. And when we think about maybe some of the stories that we are saying to ourselves in the workplace, that, wow, it is so unhealthy to do this fasting for essentially 4 weeks, and people are not taking good care of themselves. That's really judgment, if you will, that's coming through a lens of a different worldview than the Muslim community, recognizing that they have accommodations for individuals as well, and that they have a cadence of when they do break their fast. So again, what's bubbling up for you? Are you having some awareness about, wow, I know I've got all these things under control and I have really great insight? Or you may be leaning in and saying, wow, there might be some members in my workplace or in my community that I've got an opportunity to get to know or to learn more about. How about collectivistic ways of doing work or ways of doing life together, which is not collectivistic out of these groups? Canada would be the example here. The other countries are very much group oriented in terms of how they live and how they do work. And when we think about this again in our workplace, Are we making assumptions about people because maybe they prefer to come together with other people to do work and accomplish that as a team? Do we know individuals who maybe are at their best when they're doing a project or a presentation with a partner? And if you give it to them on their own, they're not showing up for themselves, but they hit it out of the park when they have someone with them. This is insight that leaders who are making decisions about people or forming teams can really have some good knowledge about. There are also individualistic cultures. Canada, the United States is a great example about that we like to do things on our own, that's where our achievement gets. But not all cultures look at it that way. So when you as a leader, as an organization, are building your teams, having insight is important. So in closing, the last poll, do you do education around different holidays? Last year, I was so proud of our local D&I team. They actually, after our holiday celebration, and that's what we call it, they actually sent out an email educating colleagues. While we were celebrating this, we want to let you know what other cultures might be celebrating. And it was an opportunity to really engage people and also to lift up an inclusive engagement strategy. So some of the colleagues on our team who maybe aren't celebrating Christmas, they might be celebrating Kwanzaa. They might not be celebrating anything during that holiday and are just coming to the party because they like their colleagues. It let them be seen, and to know that we know that there are different ways of living and we value that. In fact, we want to talk about it and educate about it. So when we think about cultural competencies, and again, I know there's a lot on this slide, but I do this with my closing slides, because when you get this recording and the slides from the chamber, I want you to have the details so you can take them to go in your organizations and really start the work. So cultural competencies, what are they? And again, when we think about all the different customs, traditions, cultures, I get overwhelmed. I get overwhelmed that I'm going to do, say, experience the right thing, if you will. But when I look at this screen and I see these examples of what's coaching me, what can I do to really develop the cultural competencies, I breathe a lot easier, because I think you're going to see some similarities. And that's the point where we are in our journey through this series, is that we talked about inclusive leadership. We've got to get our leaders to lean in. That's the first place after we do the business case. Then we really look at unconscious bias. When we are leaning in, what do we know about ourselves that are getting to be barriers for inclusion and equity? And then finally, what can I do to learn more so I can make sure that I am including and creating equitable workplaces? So I've given some examples, that me holding hands with my classmate as an example, awareness that your worldview is not everyone's worldview, and that differences even exist within worldviews. And again, if I'm showing up as me as a Christian, there might be conservative and progressive, again, using me as an example. Being aware of centering. Centering is a concept where ideas, policies, practices, ways of doing things are centered on a culture. And often in our workplaces, it is centered on the majority culture. And again, if you reflect on your culture and what holidays you might celebrate on your calendar, where are they centering on? And are there opportunities to do different and educate different? And if you are celebrating these holidays, maybe it's a floating PTO day that an individual can take to honor their customer celebration. And can we educate our team members about our colleagues who might be celebrating differently? Cultural humility is critical. And cultural humility is when I am showing up recognizing that I don't know everything about other cultures, and that I am aware that there are differences. And I try to pay attention about some biases that I might have about an individual who might show up with a head covering, as an example, who doesn't celebrate a holiday that I do. What assumptions am I making about them? And that I'm motivated for continuous learning. It's also important to make others not feel wrong or feel judged because they don't live the way that you do, or they don't see the worldview that they do. And this could be as simple as comments in the cafeteria, or if someone's heating up food. In many places in our world, rice, oil, and spices are a staple. And spices that might be garlic or cumin or hot smells. And there are individuals who speak out about that, and they don't recognize that, that's part of this individual's culture. And I invite us to think about tuna